She can't even read it. This should be fun to watch." That's what Maestro Renaldi whispered into his mic just before handing a trembling teen girl an unfinished composition on live TV, a cruel setup designed to break her. But Clara Wu didn't break. She played, not with defiance, but with depth. And when the final note faded, the world stood stunned, and the maestro who mocked her stood speechless. What began as public humiliation turned into a breathtaking story of redemption, artistry, and grace. From street pianos to the grand halls of Vienna, Clara transformed shame into healing and silence into a symphony that touched hearts across the world. This is not just a story about music, it's about the power of being underestimated and rising anyway. Now, before we dive deeper, please like and subscribe to our channel. We share powerful, meaningful stories like this every day. And drop a comment below to let us know what time and where you're watching from. Thank you so much. And now, let's get back to the story. Please tell me she's not our closing act. The words, laced with contempt and amusement, slipped through Maestro Rinaldi's thin lips and into his discreet lapel mic, unaware, or perhaps perfectly aware, that millions were watching. A teenage girl, slender and pale beneath the harsh studio lights, stood nervously beside the glossy grand piano, clutching a single sheet of music, as if it were the last thread holding her world together. Renaldi turned to the camera with a performer's poise, his smile sharp as a blade. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "our final contestant this evening is Clara Wu." There was a moment's hesitation from the audience, then a polite smattering of applause, hollow and uncertain. Clara stepped forward, her shoes making the faintest click on the polished stage. Her hair was pulled into a low braid, neat but plainly done. She wore a modest navy blue dress, something more fit for a school recital than a world stage performance. A crewman handed her a microphone. She looked at it for a heartbeat too long, then held it with trembling fingers. I'm honored to be here," she whispered. Renaldi didn't even pretend to look interested. He waved his hand dismissively, the gesture more stagecraft than necessity. "Let's skip the formalities," he said with a bemused tone. "Why don't we get straight to the music?" He reached for a folder beside him, one no contestant had seen before, and pulled out a sheet of handwritten notation. "Let's try something daring," he said, casting a sideways glance at the judges. "This is a piece I began years ago. Incomplete, unfinished, unforgiving. Perhaps we'll finally hear someone make something of it." He walked to the piano bench and laid the sheet music across it with the air of a magician preparing a trap. Clara's eyes flickered. No one else had been asked to play something unfamiliar, unrehearsed. This wasn't just unfair, it was sabotage. A murmur rose in the audience. Some leaned forward, curious, others smirked. Clara stood still for a long moment, the silence between them loud as thunder. Then, with quiet resolve, she stepped toward the piano. Backstage, her mother, May, gripped the side curtain. Her fingers were calloused from years of labor, cleaning houses, scrubbing stairs, but now they trembled. May remembered the nights Clara practiced until her knuckles ached, banging out broken melodies on a weather-warped upright, salvaged from a junkyard. They couldn't afford lessons, couldn't afford sheet music, but they had music in their blood, passed down in lullabies, carried on aching backs, breathed into the dark when there was nothing else left to dream about. Clara sat at the piano. The sheet music in front of her looked like a storm, notes scattered across the staves like lightning strikes, half-phrases floating in disjointed chaos. But there was something hidden there too. A skeleton of something beautiful, something abandoned. She placed her fingers gently on the keys, let out a long breath, and began. The first note stumbled, delicate and uncertain, like a newborn foal finding its legs. Renaldi raised an eyebrow, already prepared to dismiss her. But then, like someone finding a secret doorway in a crumbling house, Clara found the rhythm, the breath of the piece. The melody took shape, not as Renaldi had written it, but as she understood it. Something changed in the room. The audience leaned forward, the laughter died. The judges stopped taking notes. Clara's hands moved with a quiet desperation, coaxing life from the fragmented score. She was not just playing the piece, she was listening to it, pulling threads of feeling from the unfinished fabric. Her expression shifted from fear to surrender, as if she had let the music consume her completely. Behind his podium, Renaldi stiffened. The chords grew bolder, then softer. Then a rush of cascading notes like tears falling backward through time. The camera zoomed in on Clara's face, flushed now, her lips parted slightly. Not with fear, but with something closer to wonder. As if she wasn't playing the piano anymore, but remembering it, as if it had always been inside her. And somewhere, beneath the layers of fame and arrogance, Maestro Renaldi recognized the thing he had buried long ago. Emotion without ego. Honesty without applause. Clara struck the final chord. It rang out like a whisper after an argument. The audience didn't move, not right away. Then, like a tide swelling with no moon to pull it, they rose to their feet. Applause burst through the studio. Some stood with their hands clasped over their hearts. One of the judges wiped away a tear. Another whispered, "That was not the same piece we saw written." Clara looked down, stunned. Her hands still hovered above the keys, frozen. It was if she had stepped outside herself and returned to find the room changed. Maestro Renaldi remained seated, his jaw clenched. Then, ever the showman, he leaned toward his microphone and said with studied calm, "Interesting interpretation." But the weight behind his words couldn't disguise the shift. Something had slipped through his fingers, something no amount of fame or control could reclaim. Clara bowed and walked off the stage, her heartbeat echoing in her ears louder than any applause. Backstage, her mother caught her in trembling arms. "You did it," May whispered, her voice breaking. "You finished something he never could." In that moment, Clara didn't feel victorious. She felt seen, as if all the years of silence, all the nights of practicing in shadows had poured through her hands and into the world. In a dressing room a few doors down, Renaldi sat alone, staring at the sheet music. For the first time in decades, he saw it not as a monument to his genius, but as a map he never had the courage to follow. And now, a teenage girl from nowhere had walked the road for him. The applause still echoed in Clara's ears as she sat quietly on the backstage bench, her hands folded in her lap. Her fingers were trembling, not from fear anymore, but from something else. The aftermath of something too large to explain, like the quiet that follows a storm you didn't know was inside you. Her mother stood beside her, trying not to cry. May had seen her daughter fall asleep at the piano more nights than she could count, curled against the cracked wood like it was something alive. She had told Clara to be practical, to study something safe. But music, it seemed, had been Clara's second language from the moment she could walk. May knew that now, knew it in her bones. A knock came at the door, not rushed, not dramatic, just deliberate. Clara looked up as the stage manager stepped in, eyes wide like she'd just seen a ghost play Beethoven. "They want you to come back out," the woman said breathlessly. "All three judges, and the producer. They want to speak with you on air." Clara stood slowly, her knees still unsteady. "Why?" she asked, her voice quiet. "They said," the woman paused, almost laughing, "they said it's unprecedented." She walked with her mother through the winding corridors of the studio, passing walls hung with portraits of past champions, men and women who had graced that stage with fame already stamped into their names. Clara had always walked past them with eyes downcast. Now, she felt them watching her. As they neared the wings, Clara saw Maestro Renaldi standing near the curtain. Alone. His back was straight, but there was something brittle in it now, like a sculpture exposed to too many winters. He was holding a copy of his own sheet music, the page trembling slightly in his hand. She wondered if he had ever truly heard it played before tonight. He turned when he saw her. For a heartbeat, their eyes locked. There was no applause in that glance, no performance, just a silence that said, "You did something I could not." The moment passed. A producer waved her forward. She was guided back onto the stage, this time not as a hopeful, but as someone who had survived something. The audience was already standing, cameras pivoting toward her like flowers to the sun. The judges sat upright now, alert and engaged, their earlier detachment gone entirely. "Miss Wu," one of them began, a middle-aged woman known more for her icy critiques than compliments. "I have been in this chair for 9 seasons. I have watched child prodigies, international virtuosos, competition champions, but what you did, that was not performance. That was resurrection." Clara's cheeks flushed, her fingers curling instinctively at her sides. "Thank you," she said softly. Your interpretation of Maestro Rinaldi's unfinished piece, the second judge continued, was so deeply intuitive, so emotionally mature. May I ask how you studied it? I didn't, Clara replied, to audible gasps. I mean, I'd never seen it before tonight. He handed it to me just before I sat down. The camera panned slowly to Rinaldi, who stood beside his chair with the expression of a man staring into a mirror and not recognizing what he saw. I didn't know the melody, Clara added, but I heard something in the spaces, in what was missing. I just tried to follow the feeling. The third judge, a former concert pianist himself, leaned forward. You didn't follow the notes, he said. You followed the soul. The room held its breath for a long moment. Then, with a slight nod, the head judge looked toward the audience and announced, We've decided unanimously. Clara Wu is not only this evening's standout, she is now invited to perform at the Grand Laureates Gala in Vienna next month as a featured artist. Gasps turned to thunderous applause. Clara froze, overwhelmed. She hadn't even known that invitation was possible for contestants. It had only ever been extended to established professionals. Stars, legends, not girls who practiced on second-hand pianos beside laundry baskets and peeling wallpaper. As the applause thundered on, she turned instinctively, needing to see her mother. May stood just off stage, her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face like something sacred had been touched. But in the shadows behind her, Rinaldi remained still, watching. That night, long after the show ended and the cameras stopped rolling, Clara returned to her small apartment in the city's outer edges. The sun had dipped beneath the skyline, casting everything in copper and melancholy. She opened the window to let the night air in, sat at the old, upright piano in the corner, and stared at her own reflection in the lacquered black keys. The sheet music was still fresh in her mind, not just the notes, but the emptiness, the aching spaces where something human had been missing. She began to play it again, this time with her own additions. Her own heartbeat folded between the measures. She was not correcting Rinaldi. She was finishing something for him, like a daughter tucking in a father who never knew how to rest. The next day brought headlines. Teen prodigy stuns music world. Clara Wu completes Maestro's ghost piece. A legend humbled on live TV. She didn't care about any of it. The only thing she kept was a message, delivered by hand from Rinaldi himself. It was a letter. Clara, I wrote that piece 37 years ago, during the loneliest chapter of my life. I abandoned it not because it was flawed, but because I was afraid of what it revealed about me. I wanted genius without vulnerability, precision without pain. You saw what I could not bear to look at. You didn't play it to impress anyone, you played it to understand. And in doing so, you finished it with more truth than I ever could. I am no longer your judge, I am your student now. Clara folded the letter slowly, tears welling without shame. In the end, it wasn't the applause that mattered, or the fame, or even the vindication. It was this, that something broken could still be made whole by love, that the unfinished could be completed, not by perfection, but by honesty. That music, like people, sometimes needed to be heard all the way through before it made sense. Morning filtered through the slats of a dusty curtain, casting soft golden lines across Clara's hands. She sat at the piano once more, barefoot and still in the oversized hoodie she'd fallen asleep in. The apartment was quiet, the city outside not yet fully awake. Her mother had already left for work, but not without leaving a small folded note by the window, written in looping Mandarin strokes. Always be proud, my daughter. You finished what others feared to begin. Clara touched the words gently, then placed them beside Rinaldi's letter in the drawer. Neither was for display. Both were part of something sacred. She played again, not the dramatic flourishes of the televised performance, but something slower, more internal. A song that felt like memory, half-heard lullabies, footsteps in the hallway, the ticking of their old clock that never kept time properly. She didn't need cameras or judges, just these moments, just the music. But outside her window, the world had moved faster than she could catch up. Across social media platforms, her name had become a wildfire. Clara Wu, trending above world leaders, celebrities, even the gala she had just been invited to headline. People were already dissecting her expression, her outfit, her every gesture at the piano. Millions were asking the same question: where did she come from? The phone rang. She didn't recognize the number, but answered anyway. Hello? A pause, then a voice, calm, polished, unmistakably European. Miss Wu? This is Alexei Dvorak, chair of the Vienna Laureates Gala Committee. Forgive the early call, but I wanted to personally extend my congratulations and my request. Clara blinked. Your request? Yes, he said. We'd like you to open the gala next month, not just perform. Open. That role has traditionally been reserved for lifetime legends. But after what you did on that stage, what you completed, we believe there's no better artist to begin this year's journey. Clara's heart began to pound in her chest. There's one more thing, Dvorak added, voice softening. Renaldi has offered to conduct the opening performance if you accept. She didn't answer right away. The air felt suddenly too thick, too alive with memories. Renaldi, the man who had tried to humiliate her, who had weaponized silence and made a stage feel like a battlefield, now asking to conduct her? Would you consider it? He asked again, sensing her pause. I'll need time, she whispered. Of course, he replied. But please understand, we're not asking you to forgive what happened. We're asking you to lead something bigger than all of us. She hung up gently, her mind spinning like a leaf caught in a draft. She didn't tell anyone that night. Not her mother, not the judges who had become sudden mentors, not the journalists who now waited outside her apartment like hawks in tailored suits. She went for a walk instead, down the narrow side streets where no one knew her face, past the church where she used to sneak in to play the piano when no one was around, past the playground where she first imagined symphonies in the rhythm of swings and footsteps, and finally to the train station. The old upright piano was still there, scratched, out of tune, paint flaking from the legs. A sign above it read, "Play me." She sat, no lights, no audience, just travelers and passers-by and cold vending machine coffee. She began to play, not Rinaldi's piece, not anything that could be found on a score, just sound, her sound, like breath made tangible. A melody born from longing and patience and the aching spaces between notes. People stopped. They didn't clap. They didn't record. They just stood. A child pulled on her mother's sleeve. Is she famous? The mother leaned down and whispered, She's something better. Clara finished and stood up, leaving the keys still warm from her hands. She walked away before anyone could stop her. But one person had watched from afar, Renaldi. He didn't approach. He didn't interrupt. He simply stood in the shadows, listening with his arms folded and his pride stripped away. Not the maestro, not the critic, just a man who had once written something impossible and watched a girl make it real. The next day he wrote another letter. Clara, we spend years believing that mastery comes from control, from perfection, from bending sound to our will. But what you reminded me, what you taught me, is that the greatest music comes from surrender. You took a piece I abandoned and gave it a home. I would be honored, not as a maestro, but as a man, if you would allow me to walk beside you for the next part of the journey. Not to lead, just to accompany. Renaldi. She read it 3 times. The offer from Vienna still hung unanswered. But in that letter, she saw something she never expected. Humility. The kind that only follows failure and growth. She called him that afternoon. I'll accept, she said. But not because I forgot what you did. I'll accept because you finally heard what I played. There was silence on the line, then Rinaldi's voice, barely above a whisper. Thank you. 1 month later, Clara stood on the stage of the Vienna Opera House. Gold-framed balconies curved above her like a halo. The audience, dressed in elegance and expectation, held its collective breath. Behind her, Renaldi raised the baton, not with flourish, but reverence. And as the first note rang through the hall, Clara played, not to prove anything, not to reclaim dignity or shock the world, but to begin something finished, something free. The final chord echoed like the last heartbeat of something holy. For a moment, the Vienna Opera House didn't move. Not a rustle of a program, not a single whisper, only the sound of sound leaving. Then came the standing ovation, slow at first, like rising dawn, before erupting into thunderous applause that shook the chandeliers above. Dignitaries clapped until their palms burned. Cellists wiped tears from their cheeks. Even the reserved Austrian president, seated in the second row, rose to his feet. Clara remained seated, hands still suspended above the keys, breathing like she'd just stepped out of a storm. Her dress, simple and slate blue, shimmered slightly under the lights as if made from woven silence. She didn't look at the crowd. Not yet. Instead, she turned her head slightly, just enough to meet the eyes of the man behind her. Renaldi lowered his baton. No bow, no flourish, just a nod, small, but full. For all his years conducting the greats, for all the awards and ivory batons and lifetime ovations, this was the moment that would follow him to the end. They took their bows together, and when they did, it was not maestro and pupil, not man and girl. It was two artists who had once stood on opposite sides of a wound and met at its healing. Backstage, the chaos was blinding. Reporters surged like waves, microphones thrust forward, every question tumbling over the next. How did it feel, Miss Wu, to open the gala? Maestro Renaldi, how do you respond to critics who say you tried to sabotage her weeks ago? What's next for you, Clara? She smiled softly, her voice calm in the flood. I think what's next is listening. That night, Renaldi and Clara sat side by side in the quiet of a nearby cafe. Not a five-star place, just a modest, wood-paneled corner spot down a side street, one he had once frequented long ago when he'd still believed in struggle more than spotlights. I never thanked you properly, he said, swirling the untouched espresso in his cup. For the humiliation or the redemption? Clara asked, a half-smile ghosting across her lips. He let out a breath that was almost a laugh. Both. There was no bitterness in her voice, just honesty. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, aged at the edges, notes scribbled across it like weathered footprints. This, he said, laying it on the table, was the piece I wrote when I was 20, the real one, the full version. I never showed it to anyone. Clara stared at the page, eyes tracing the faded ink. It wasn't complicated. It wasn't grand. It was raw, aching and beautiful in its restraint. I wrote it the day my father died, he said, voice softer now. He never heard me conduct, never saw what I became. I left home angry, bitter. I thought if I made myself big enough, famous enough, I wouldn't feel that emptiness anymore. Clara's hand hovered above the page but didn't touch it. But you felt it, she said. He nodded. I never finished it because I thought, if I did, it would make the grief real. Clara looked at him, really looked. Not as the man who had mocked her on national television. Not as the maestro with the tailored suits and sharp tongue, but as someone just trying to make peace with the things he couldn't undo. I'd like to play it, she said quietly, as it was, and maybe play what comes after. His eyes met hers. He didn't smile. He understood. Back in New York, her old neighborhood hadn't changed. The laundry line still swung over the narrow alley. The cracked steps to her apartment still creaked in the same places. The piano, her childhood one, still sat crooked in the corner. Her mother had cleaned it, polished it, placed a single white lily on top like a gesture of reverence. Clara sat down before it with the old score Renaldi had given her. She played it the way he wrote it. Slow, grieving, gentle as a goodbye whispered to the wind. And then, when the last note faded, she kept going. She wove in her own melody, the one born from silence and small victories. The one shaped by resilience, by all the moments no one saw. The bus rides with cold fingers, the days of practicing while her mother cooked in the next room. The rejection letters, the weight of wanting more when more wasn't promised. It wasn't a composition, it was a letter. A reply. She didn't post it online, didn't perform it for a gala. She sent it to Renaldi, in an envelope, no return address. He played it in private, just once, and wept. 2 months later, a scholarship fund was launched in Clara's name, anonymous in origin but bearing one clause, for artists of untaught genius who know music by feel, not by rule. She never claimed ownership. Never needed to. One evening, as spring cracked open over the city like sunlight through a keyhole, she walked past the old train station. The upright piano was gone, moved somewhere, she was told. But someone had carved 3 words into the bench beneath it. She heard everything. Clara sat, not to play. Just to sit. She was no longer the girl who needed to prove herself, no longer the underdog, the outsider, the threat to tradition. She was simply Clara, and that, now, was enough. Rain painted the windows of the conservatory like music notes in motion, soft, restless, imperfect. Inside, Clara moved quietly between practice rooms, her footsteps muffled by the smooth wooden floors. Students passed her without a second glance. Just another girl in a gray cardigan, hair pulled back in a low twist, clutching a stack of sheet music that looked too worn to belong to anyone famous. And that's just how she liked it. Fame, she had discovered, was a kind of echo, loud in the beginning, but fading the further you got from the source. And Clara had walked far from it, on purpose. She'd turned down the offers, the record labels, the flashy tours, the press junkets with their endless cycle of interviews that always circled back to the same moment. What was it like to humble Maestro Renaldi on live television? But she hadn't wanted to humble anyone. She had only wanted to be heard. Now, at 20, she was back where it all began. Not in her mother's living room, not on the international stage, but in the places in between. Teaching, listening, playing in corners where music still felt sacred, not staged. This conservatory was different. It wasn't grand, it wasn't elite. It was tucked behind a row of weathered bookstores in a neighborhood more known for its chipped paint and second chances than for prestigious institutions. But it had a piano in every room. And more importantly, it had students who reminded Clara of who she used to be, hungry, invisible, aching to matter. Today, she had a new student. She peeked into the small rehearsal room and saw her sitting there, knees swinging nervously under the stool, eyes darting from the wall clock to the window to the piano keys and back again. She couldn't have been more than 10. Braids tied with mismatched ribbons. Fingers tapping the edge of the bench like she was already playing something in her mind. Clara smiled and stepped in gently. "Hi," she said. "I'm Clara. You must be Ava." The girl nodded but didn't speak. Her eyes, large and alert, scanned Clara like she wasn't sure if she was safe. Clara didn't sit. She didn't speak again right away. She simply walked over to the piano, opened the cover, and began to play. Nothing showy. Just a melody so simple it could have been mistaken for a lullaby. The kind of song that wrapped itself around a child's ear like a mother's voice in the dark. After a few bars, Ava scooted closer. Then, with a quiet bravery, she reached out and played a single note, off-key, but strong. Clara didn't flinch. She shifted the melody and incorporated Ava's note, then another, and another. Soon, they were playing something entirely new. When they finished, Ava looked up, eyes wide with the kind of wonder that doesn't need language. "I didn't know I could do that," she whispered. Clara leaned in. "You didn't do it alone. We listened to each other." And in that moment, a tiny spark passed between them, one that had nothing to do with technique or fame or perfection. Just trust. Just music. Later that evening, as Clara packed up her things, she paused in the hallway. A faded flyer was pinned to the wall. Annual Youth Showcase, faculty welcome to participate. She hadn't played in public in nearly a year. Not since Vienna. Not since the piece she'd mailed to Rinaldi and the letter that came back. "You gave it a soul I never deserved." He'd retired soon after. Quietly, without fanfare. Clara didn't miss the spotlight. But sometimes, in the stillness before sleep, she missed the dialogue. That moment when music wasn't performance, but conversation. She thought about Ava, about the other students who watched her, not because of who she had once been, but because of who they believed they could become. That night, Clara took out a blank sheet of manuscript paper and began to write, not for the world, for them. The piece unfolded slowly, not as a single sweeping arc, but as a collection of moments, childlike motifs threaded through more mature harmonies, echoes of early struggle, notes that hesitated, then soared. It was not technical brilliance she was chasing. It was recognition. She wanted them to hear themselves in the music. The showcase came quickly. The hall was small but full. Students sat in neat rows, wide-eyed and dressed in their best, some with shoes too big, others with hair combed into unfamiliar shapes by proud parents. Clara stepped up to the stage without announcement. She didn't say her name. She didn't mention her past. She sat at the piano and began to play. At first the room fidgeted. Adults shifted in their seats. Phones were discreetly checked, but within moments the air changed. The piece pulled them in. Children leaned forward. Teachers stopped whispering. The melody unfolded like a story told around a fire, softly, honestly, with no need for grandeur. There were moments that sounded like laughter, others that trembled like a secret, and at the very center, a motif that belonged to Ava, a four-note phrase that had come from her uncertain finger in their first lesson. When the final note rang out, no one clapped right away. They didn't need to. Clara stood bowed gently and left the stage. Backstage, Ava rushed into her arms. "That was me in the middle," she said breathlessly. "I heard it. I heard me." Clara knelt down, eye level. "You were the heart of it," she said. "All I did was listen." That night, alone in her apartment, Clara stared at the ceiling as the city sighed beneath her window. She thought of all the rooms she had played in. The ones filled with chandeliers and critics, and the ones with broken benches and sticky keys, and she realized something. The most important stages were never the ones built for performance. They were the ones built for connection. And in that quiet moment, she knew. She had finally become the kind of artist she had once dreamed of finding. The seasons had changed again. Spring bowed into summer without much ceremony, just a warmer breeze threading through the curtains, and longer shadows falling across Clara's music sheets in the evenings. Her days were full now, of students, of melodies left half-finished until someone brave enough picked them back up, of old pianos in need of tuning, and young hearts in need of belief. But her nights belonged to something else. She had begun composing again. Not for others. Not for recitals or judges or the echo of clapping hands. These pieces were different, fragments of a life being quietly lived. Pieces without titles, just feelings. Just memory set to key and silence and breath. She didn't know if she'd ever share them, until a letter arrived. It came in a brown envelope, thick and wrinkled, postmarked from a place she'd never heard of, a small village tucked in the mountains of northern Italy. Inside was a short note, handwritten in strong, slanting script. "Clara, I've been living simply, teaching children, walking by the river, listening more than I speak. You were right, about all of it. There's a festival here in the fall, intimate, honest, not televised. They've asked me to curate one evening. I told them I would, but only if you came. Not to perform, just to play. For us. For those who still believe in what music was before it became spectacle. If you say no, I'll understand, but I hope you'll come. I hope you'll forgive me fully. Not with words, but with a shared silence. Always, A. Renaldi." Clara folded the letter carefully. She sat at her piano and looked out the window. A group of children were laughing in the courtyard below. One of them had a violin case strapped to his back, too big for his frame. It bounced as he ran, but he held it like something sacred. That night she didn't compose. She didn't play. She just listened. To the wind, to the memory of the past, to the still, soft yes blooming inside her. A month later, she stood at the edge of a cobbled square nestled between orange-tiled rooftops and lavender hills. The village felt untouched by time. Stone buildings with iron balconies, grapevines growing wild around fences, and a small concert hall with no more than 80 seats. Renaldi was waiting at the entrance, a little thinner, a little slower in his movements, but somehow more whole. He didn't speak when he saw her. He opened his arms, she stepped into them. That evening they sat at a single grand piano in the center of the stage. No spotlight, no microphone, just a warm circle of candlelight and wooden walls that held sound like secrets. Renaldi played first, a quiet prelude. Nothing complex, just a hymn of apology without words. He played with the fragility of someone unlearning pride. Then Clara joined him. They didn't rehearse, they didn't plan, they simply played. Chords passed between them like conversation, not loud, not flawless, but honest. Themes slipped in, echoes of his unfinished composition, fragments of the melody she had once mailed him, even the four-note phrase born from Ava's small hand months ago. And at one point, mid-song, they both stopped, without cue, without reason. The silence hung, rich and golden. No one in the room moved. Then Clara played a single note. He followed. And they began again. When it ended, the audience didn't rise, they didn't clap, they breathed, and somehow that was louder than any ovation. Outside, the village stars blinked overhead. Renaldi and Clara sat on a bench overlooking the vineyard, listening to the wind rustle through olive branches. "I never told you what I heard," he said quietly, not looking at her. Clara glanced over. "That night on TV?" He nodded. "You weren't playing my music, you were rewriting my grief." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. "I spent so long thinking mastery meant control," he continued. "But you showed me something else. That sometimes the only way to finish something is to let go." Clara tilted her head. "And has it helped? Letting go?" He smiled faintly. "I sleep better." She laughed softly. "Then it was worth it." A breeze moved between them, gentle and warm. The smell of pine and stone and old earth filled the air. Renaldi turned to her then, fully. "What will you do next?" Clara looked out at the hills. She thought of her students, of Ava, of the music resting unfinished on her kitchen table. She thought of the little pieces of her scattered across notes and rooms and names people would never know. "I don't know," she said. Then, after a breath, "But I think I'll keep listening." The train back from Italy hummed steadily beneath Clara's seat, a soft percussion to the thoughts threading through her mind like threads of an old melody. She sat by the window, hands folded in her lap, eyes tracing the silhouettes of cypress trees and rolling vineyards fading into the dusk. Her heart wasn't heavy, but it wasn't light either. It was something in between. There had been something sacred about that small village performance, something fragile, like porcelain still warm from a kiln. No stage lights, no applause. Just music shared between two people who had once stood on opposite sides of silence. Clara knew, as the train sped toward the familiar, that not everything had been resolved, but something had been released, and that, perhaps, was enough. Back in the city, life unfolded the way it always did. Uneventfully at first, like pages turning quietly in a book no one thought to read aloud. Clara returned to the conservatory. Her students were waiting, bright-eyed, out of tune, unapologetically themselves. She greeted each one with that same quiet grace, never reminding them who she'd been to the world, only reminding them who they could be to themselves. She never brought up Renaldi, until one rainy Tuesday, a girl named Ava raised her hand at the end of class. "Miss Clara?" she asked, tilting her head. "Is it true that man who once yelled at you on TV is the same one who writes you letters now?" There was no malice in her tone, just curiosity, pure and wide-eyed. Clara smiled. "Yes," she said, "he does." Ava blinked. "Why?" Clara walked to the chalkboard and erased a line of scales. "Because," she said, turning back to the class, "sometimes people don't understand what they've broken until they hear what it sounds like whole." The room fell quiet, and for the first time Clara told them the story. Not the version on the internet, not the one trimmed into sound bites and hashtags, but the truth. About fear and expectations, about betrayal and forgiveness, about the unfinished things we carry and the people who help us lay them down. And when she finished, a boy in the front row whispered, "That sounds like music." Clara nodded. It was. The next week she began a new project, a recording, not for sale, not for critics, not even for publication, just for preservation, for legacy, for the things that mattered when the applause had faded and the cameras had long stopped rolling. She titled it Variations on Silence. Each piece was written with someone in mind, her mother, Ava, her younger self, even Renaldi, whose theme she wove like a thread through each composition. Sometimes bold, sometimes hidden, sometimes unresolved. She recorded late at night in the small studio 2 blocks from her apartment, the kind that smelled of wood dust and old tape reels. She liked the imperfections in the acoustics, the slight echo that made each note feel like it had traveled through time to find its way home. One night, just before dawn, she sat back in the booth after finishing the last take. Her hands were sore, her eyes ached, but she felt full, not famous, not brilliant, not legendary, just full. She stared through the glass at the silent piano in the other room and whispered, "Thank you." She didn't need a response. The music had already spoken. The final track of the recording was a single take, just her and the old theme she had first played on the television stage years ago. The same piece Renaldi had once handed her to humiliate her. But now it belonged to both of them. She played it slowly, tenderly, each note a conversation she hadn't realized she was still having. There were no fireworks in that performance, no sudden crescendos, just the sound of something once broken, made whole in the most human way possible, not with precision but with presence. The track ended in silence, and she let it linger. She sent the recording to exactly 7 people, no press, no social media post, just handwritten notes, each one saying only, "This is what came after." One went to Renaldi. He wrote back within a week. "Clara, I listened with my eyes closed. I saw my mother, my father, myself, you. I saw the years I wasted chasing applause when I should have been chasing understanding. I envy what you found, not because it is rare, but because it is honest. You made peace into music. I will spend the rest of my life learning how to do the same. Thank you for finishing my beginning." A winter settled into the city like an old lover returning home, slow, cold, inevitable. The conservatory held fewer students now, most having returned to their families or warmer climates. Clara remained. She began holding free evening sessions, open to anyone who wanted to come. Janitors, grandmothers, teenagers with broken instruments, the curious, the heartbroken, the shy. No auditions, no judgment, just music. One night, a homeless man named Ellis wandered in. He hadn't touched a piano in years, his fingers crooked from frost and work. Clara didn't ask him to explain. She simply nodded to the bench. He played one broken chord. She added a second. Together, they built a song that would never be repeated. After he left, she scribbled the melody down in the margins of her notebook and titled it simply Ellis Thursday. And that's how her life became. Not an encore, but an offering. No longer waiting for the world to hear her, but listening, deeply, to the world around her. The girl once humiliated in front of millions had become something else entirely. Not a prodigy, not a headline, not a miracle, but a mirror, a vessel, a voice in a world too often too loud to hear itself think. And in the stillness between each note, she finally understood that the music she was born to play was never meant to impress. It was meant to heal. Snow fell like whispers across the rooftops. Clara sat on the floor of her apartment, a wool blanket draped around her shoulders, warm tea cooling by her side. In front of her, the floor was scattered with sheet music, some scribbled in pencil, others carefully inked, a few crumpled and softened at the edges from nights she couldn't sleep. There was no order to the chaos, just memory, preserved in sound. The city had grown quieter in winter. The usual buzz of sirens and subway rumbles now muffled beneath layers of frost and slush. But in that silence, music bloomed. Not from the stages or the institutions, but from open windows, from the small child humming on a bus, from the young man practicing violin in the alley where the echo bent like a second voice. Clara had begun noticing the music in everything. The clink of dishes from the apartment above, the turning of a key in a lock, the first step of boots on ice, and perhaps more than anything, the silence after something meaningful. She had begun a new project, though she hadn't called it that out loud. It wasn't a composition or an album. It was a collection, tiny moments turned into vignettes for piano, each one under 3 minutes, each one inspired by someone else's story. She called them miniatures of the unseen. Each night, she'd walk the city, notebook tucked in her coat pocket, letting the world unfold in front of her. One night, she passed a laundromat just as a woman inside dropped a sweater and burst into tears. Clara didn't stop her, didn't ask what had happened, but she went home and wrote a piece that started with a falling motif and ended with a single sustained note, trembling just before it let go. She titled it Spin Cycle for the woman at 12th and Green. Another night, she passed an elderly man feeding birds with such gentleness it made her chest tighten. The next morning, she wrote Breadcrumb Waltz. No one commissioned these works. No one paid for them. She uploaded them quietly to a website with no name, no credits, just one line on the homepage. If you heard something in this, it belonged to you. And somehow people found them. Emails began to trickle in, then letters, then art, paintings, poems, a photograph of a child asleep next to a speaker. One letter read, "I listened to Spin Cycle after my miscarriage. I didn't know how to speak. Your music spoke for me. Thank you." Another, "Breadcrumb Waltz made my grandfather smile in hospice. He said it reminded him of walking with his mother in the snow. He died that night, still smiling." Clara read every message. Sometimes she wept. Sometimes she simply closed her eyes and whispered, "Thank you for listening." She never replied. Not because she didn't care, but because the reply had already been given. In the keys, in the silence between them, in the fragile connection that passed from heart to hand to sound. And then one evening in late January, she received a package. It was small, wrapped in plain paper, no return address. Inside, a journal, leather-bound, worn at the corners, with a name etched faintly on the inside cover, Renaldi. Her breath caught. The pages weren't full of words, only short entries, observations, reflections, and sometimes just single lines. "I heard a boy whistling today in the rain. I thought it was a flute until I saw his grin. There is music in the way grief waits for you at the door, pretending not to recognize you at first. Clara is not what I expected. She is what I needed." On the final page, dated just 2 weeks before, a small envelope was tucked inside. It held a key and a note. to the little house on Lake Como. For when you are ready to play where no one else can hear you, it is yours now. Clara read it twice, then closed the book and held it to her chest. The little house. She had heard him mention it once, in passing. A retreat. A place where he used to go before the world knew his name. Before music became expectation. She didn't pack right away. She let the idea sit in her like warm tea on a cold night, steeping slowly. She finished her week of lessons, sent out her last miniature, left a message for Ava promising she'd be back in time for her recital. Then she boarded a plane. The house was just as he had described it, modest, perched on the hillside above the lake, its windows fogged by winter, its garden dusted with snow. The front door creaked in greeting. The air inside smelled faintly of cedar and rain. There was a piano in the center of the main room. Not a grand, not even a baby grand. Just a humble upright, its keys ivory-tipped and well-loved. She didn't play that night. Instead, she lit a fire and sat by the window, watching the lake shift beneath the moonlight. The stillness reminded her of Vienna, of the silence that followed her last note there, of Rinaldi's bowed head, of the way redemption never arrives with fanfare, only with breath and surrender. The next morning she played. No microphones, no lights, just her and him in memory. She played the unfinished piece he had once dared her to fail at, but this time she rewrote the ending, not in defiance but in compassion. She played it the way she imagined he might have, had he let himself feel what he feared. She played it like a lullaby for a man who finally learned to sleep. And when she was done, she sat for a long time with her hands in her lap. A single tear slipped down her cheek, not of sorrow, of peace. Outside, the lake rippled with the breeze, and somewhere she believed he had heard it too. The sun rose slowly over Lake Como, filtering gold through misted glass and warming the wooden floors of the small house, one silent beam at a time. Clara stood barefoot in the kitchen, holding a cup of tea, watching the light stretch like a brushstroke across the piano's surface. It had been 3 days since she arrived. 3 days of playing and resting, of remembering and releasing, of reading Rinaldi's journal in quiet pieces, allowing each fragment to settle like ash on her skin. She'd found herself whispering things aloud, sentences to no one, confessions to the walls. She wasn't sure if they were prayers or goodbyes. The piano, though old, had a warmth in its tone that made each note feel like a conversation with an old friend. And so Clara had spoken through it, each melody a word she didn't know how to say. She wrote nothing down. Let each session dissolve into the walls and the air. The house was full of ghosts, but none of them felt threatening. On the 4th morning, snow began to fall again. She opened the door, letting the wind kiss her cheeks, and stepped outside with a scarf wrapped loosely around her neck. The lake had that stillness unique to winter mornings, like the whole world had paused to exhale. Across the way, just beyond the tree line, she saw the edge of the old trail Rinaldi had mentioned in one of his entries, a path that led to the lookout point where he used to sit with his father as a child. She tucked her hands into her coat pockets and began to walk. The trail was uneven and dusted with frost, winding through ancient trees that creaked gently in the wind. Birds flitted above her, and she could hear the low rustle of distant water below. The climb wasn't steep, but it was steady, and by the time she reached the summit, her breath came in small clouds. The view was staggering. The lake below stretched out like brushed metal, framed by sleeping hills and rooftops with smoke curling gently into the sky. From up here, the world looked smaller, quieter, more forgiving. There was a wooden bench near the edge, half covered in snow. Clara brushed it off and sat down. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the final page of Rinaldi's journal, the only page that had been left blank, save for one line written in the lower right corner. Some notes don't need to be played, they just need to be heard. She ran her fingers over the words, then tucked the page into the folds of her scarf, holding it close to her chest, and then she closed her eyes and listened to the wind, to the distant hum of the village waking, to the echo of a man who had once taught her that the stage could be cruel, and later, that the silence afterward could be sacred. She stayed on that bench until the cold made her fingers stiff. That night, she sat at the piano once more. This time, she played one of her miniatures, Ellis, Thursday, but slower, softer. She let the silence between the notes stretch longer than usual, like the pauses in a conversation where you realize there's nothing more that needs to be said. And then she did something she hadn't done in years. She recorded it. Not in a studio, just on her phone. One take. No edits. When she finished, she stared at the screen for a long time. Then, with a quiet breath, she attached the file to a message. To Ava Lynn, avapiano@student.edu. Subject, a gift for your hands. This piece carries a story I've been waiting to pass on. It doesn't belong to me anymore. It belongs to whoever plays it next with love. She sent it and immediately turned off the phone. In the days that followed, she wandered the village, bought bread from the old woman with the crooked glasses, sat in the pews of the tiny stone church even though she wasn't religious, just because she liked the smell of candles and wood polish. One afternoon, a child tugged on her sleeve and offered her a red paper heart. She took it and folded it into her journal. And then, quietly, she knew. It was time to go home. Back in the city, things had changed. Subtly but undeniably. The conservatory had moved buildings. Her favorite coffee shop had closed down, replaced by something sleeker, louder. Ava had grown 3 inches and was playing Chopin with a tenderness that made Clara's chest ache. But the piano in her apartment was exactly where she had left it. There was a letter waiting on the bench. Ava's handwriting. Miss Clara, I played your piece. At the winter recital. I didn't tell anyone it was yours. I just said it was about a man named Ellis and a woman who knew how to listen. People cried. One girl asked if she could learn it. I said she couldn't. Because it's not something you learn. You just feel it. Thank you for trusting me. I'll take care of your music until I can write my own. Love. Ava Clara folded the letter slowly, pressing it against her heart. That night, she lit a candle beside the piano, pulled the curtains open wide and let the city spill into her apartment. She didn't sit at the bench right away. She stood by the window and watched the people moving below, each one carrying something. A memory, a hope, a note left unplayed. And she whispered, almost to herself, I'm still listening. Then she turned and began to play. The candle burned low beside the piano, its flame dancing gently with the hush of midnight. Clara played with her eyes closed, not for an audience, not even for herself, but for the space between things, for the moments that couldn't be named, for the ache behind memories and the breath before healing. Each note she pressed was soft, intentional, a whisper that lingered longer than it should, like someone saying goodbye at the door but never quite stepping away. She didn't notice when the streetlight flickered outside, or when the clock ticked past 1, or when the city finally surrendered to sleep. In that hour, time dissolved. What remained was the music. And her. A girl who once stood trembling before a stage, now standing on her own, not in defiance, but in grace. She played until her hands grew tired. Then she let the last chord fade into the night and sat in silence, listening to it echo, even when it was gone. For a long while she didn't move. Then slowly she rose. At her writing desk there was a folder she'd kept for years, tucked away in a drawer beneath old recital programs and yellowing pages of adolescent compositions. She opened it now for the first time in months. Inside, the original sheet music Renaldi had handed her on live television. The unfinished composition, the one meant to trap her, break her, define her. She stared at it, the ink now slightly faded. Her fingers hovered over it before reaching for a pencil. In the quiet of the room, she wrote one final line at the bottom of the page. Completed not by brilliance, but by belief. She placed it back in the folder and sealed it with care, not as an artifact, but as a reminder. Not of what had been done to her, but of what she had chosen to do instead. Morning light broke gently over the horizon, washing the room in a soft golden hue. It caught on the spine of her miniature collection, now bound and resting on the piano, titled For Those Who Were Never Asked to Play. She had printed 20 copies, given them to students, to libraries, to the girl who played violin in the subway with shoes too thin for winter. No liner notes, no author name, just a page at the beginning. If this reached your hands, then it was always meant for your heart. A knock echoed at the door. She wasn't expecting anyone. When she opened it, a boy no older than 13 stood there. He held a backpack across his chest like a shield and a wrinkled flyer in his hand. Are you Clara? He asked, his voice cracking slightly. Clara Wu? Yes. He held up the flyer. It was one she'd printed months ago and forgotten about, an open invitation to her community piano sessions. Free, no experience needed. Just come and try. I've never played, he said quickly, almost ashamed. But I heard something, one of your miniatures. I didn't know music could sound like how I feel. Clara opened the door wider. Come in, she said gently. You're right on time. He stepped inside like someone entering a church for the first time, wide-eyed, unsure, reverent. She led him to the piano, offered him the bench, and sat beside him. Which one did you hear? She asked. He hesitated, then said, the one with the lady in the laundromat. Clara smiled. I remember her. She placed his fingers on the keys, hesitant, curled inward like they were afraid to touch beauty. Then she played the first 3 notes. He played the next one. They built the piece together, and in that moment, the cycle completed. Not with thunder, not with spectacle, but with a single, uncertain note played by someone who just wanted to feel less alone. Clara didn't cry, but her heart did something softer, something deeper. It opened. Later that day, she stood at her window again, watching the world below. Somewhere, a saxophone player was rehearsing. A girl across the street sang quietly into her phone, unaware anyone could hear. A boy beat a rhythm on a plastic bucket, chasing a tempo only he understood. Music was everywhere, and for the first time in her life, Clara felt she didn't need to go out searching for it anymore. It had always been here. It had always been listening back. And now, so was she. There's a rare kind of strength that doesn't raise its voice. It doesn't fight to be seen. It listens. It learns. It endures. And when the world tells it to sit quietly, it speaks through action, through art, through grace, through the steady pulse of resilience. Clara Wu's story reminds us that greatness isn't found in applause, but in the courage to keep playing even when the room goes silent. It teaches us that humiliation doesn't get the final word. Humility does. That forgiveness isn't weakness. It's mastery over your own spirit. And that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do with pain is transform it into something beautiful for others to hold. We are all, in some way, unfinished pieces. But that doesn't make us broken. It makes us human. So keep playing your song, even if your hands shake, even if your voice cracks, even if the world tries to stop you, because somewhere, someone is listening. And in that quiet moment, you might just change everything.